it's Mrs. Code. I thought that I would come and do a little bit of cooking with you because my lovely mum, who's self-isolating due to this horrid COVID-19, has asked if I could make her some scones. And that's because sometimes home baking makes us all feel a little bit better, doesn't it? So I'm going to make these scones and take them to her house and leave them at the end of her path so that she can collect them safely. And it got me to thinking that maybe you'd like to make some scones. So I'm going to use what I've got in the house, and for some of you that might be a little bit difficult to find. I know that I've found it quite difficult to get flour, so if you can't get self-raising flour for this recipe, then you may have to use some plain flour and add some baking powder. Whatever you can get is absolutely fine for that. Equally, if you would like to add raisins, like I'm doing, I had some in. But if you haven't got raisins, it could well be cherries, glacier cherries, or it could be plain. And I know that lots of you, lots of the students that I teach in school would prefer scones plain anyway. It should be, for this recipe, hard margarine. That's the margarine that you would find in like a gold wrapper in the supermarkets, but I haven't got any at home. I've only got this type of margarine. So I'm going to use that. And then caster sugar, and literally I've just had to take that from the tea coffee sugar jar. So it's a bit lumpy here and there, but it'll be fine. And it'll do the job. Fortunately, we don't need to need much sugar for this recipe. The other thing that we need is some milk, and this could be any type of milk. Don't go using mum and dad's milk if you've got a shortage of it. In fact, UHT milk, which is the stuff that lasts forever in the cupboard, your mum and dad may have some, and that will work just fine for this recipe as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by adding the flour, and the flour here is 250 grams of self-raising flour. Again, if you can't get it, then you'll have to just maybe make it up a little bit with plain and some baking powder. I'm going to put that in, not sieving it or anything. If I was at school or perhaps doing this for something where I wanted an even rise, I might sieve it to get some air into it, but as we're just doing this for making somebody's day. As you can see, I've washed my hands for the 857th time today. I'm wearing an apron, although I am sat down, which is unconventional, but needs must, and I've tied my hair up, so we're all okay in terms of hygiene. I've also made sure that everything that I'm going to use is nice and clean, including the baking tray. So the first thing that I'm going to add is the butter, or the margarine rather. And when we do this, I find it, and I mean you're going to have to get your hands dirty anyway, so I find it kind of good to just pull little bits off like this. And you could use a knife if you prefer, but to be quite honest, your fingers are going in there anyway. And what we're going to do is we're going to rub this butter or margarine into the flour. And incidentally, you could use butter should you have any, but I'm working on lockdown ingredients here. So what we're going to use is the tips of our fingers, and this is called shortening actually. Now, not particularly for this recipe, but if you're going to be doing, for instance, shortbread or short crust pastry, then what we'd be doing by rubbing the fat into the flour in this way would be to limit the amount of gluten that was able to form when a liquid was added. Now we are going to add a liquid here, and we do, to an extent, want not as much gluten as perhaps we'd like in bread, and so the fat here will do that job. But in actual fact, what we want from a scone, or a scone, dependent on how you say it, is we want it to be kind of crispy on the outside, like almost like a bread crust, to be quite fair, but not as chewy. And then the inside we want to be nice and light and fluffy, and give that sort of cakey type texture that we know and love for spreading jam and cream on. So when we've done rubbing this in, and it's a bit awkward from this angle because I'm usually stood up, but unfortunately Mrs. Code's ability to video myself stood up in my kitchen just wasn't going to work that way. So when we've done, I can see, look, that there's not very many big lumps of margarine left anymore, and actually what we say at this stage is that it looks a bit like wet sand, and I think that's probably completely done. Now the sugar, you need 20, I don't think I gave you how much butter, did I? So 50 grams, apologies, 50 grams of this margarine. So we have 250 grams of self-raising flour and then 50 grams of butter. So the ratio there is 1 to 5, okay? Now, the sugar that I've got today is actually caster sugar. We've had a bit of a shortage of sugar where we live, and it's been difficult to get. And so actually I've been using caster sugar in my tea and coffee, so that's why this will be okay. If you've only got granulated sugar though, the stuff that you do genuinely supposed to put in tea and coffee, that's fine as well in this recipe, but this is the finer stuff, the caster sugar. And actually the recipe only calls for 25 grams, although I've got 35 grams in here because I intend to save a little bit back to put on top of the scones before they go in the oven, because I find that really nice. So I'm just going to tip that in and save a little bit back for sprinkling later on. At this point, if you prefer, you could switch to a wooden spoon. Sometimes I'm a bit along the lines of, do we really need to dirty something that we're going to use once if your hands will do? But some people feel differently about putting their hands into different textures, so if you want to, you can switch to a spoon. Now if you're going to make plain scones, that's it, other than the milk. But because I'm putting fruit in mine, I'm going to put the raisins in, and you can use all sorts of fruit for this, dried fruit. You can use sultanas, you can use apricots, that's very nice in scones. You can use glacier cherries, as I said. You can even make scones in a savoury way, which means not sweet. So you could leave out the 25 grams of caster sugar and instead add a little pinch of salt and perhaps some grated cheese. Cheese scones are amazing, and a really nice change for sandwiches in the middle of the day, because I'm not sure about you, but my children have been getting a little bit fed up of sandwiches for lunch because we've been in the house for about 173 years. So cheese scones are really good. In any case, I've put my raisins in, and now I'm going to swap to a different tool, and it's a round bladed knife, or the type of knife that you would eat with, an eating knife, so it's not sharp, in other words. And the reason that I'm going to use this is because when I add the milk now, I need to kind of cut through it, and I don't want the milk to all be absorbed in one area of the flour and then make it soggy. I want to kind of keep it moving around. Now, just talking about milk, I have here 150 millilitres of milk. I only need 125 for this particular recipe, but I knew that this was going to be an issue. Okay, see what I did there. But I've put 150 in because sometimes, dependent on how well you've measured things or how old or new your flour is, you might need a bit more. It could be thirstier. So we're going to add a little bit at a time, and we're going to use the knife. If you've ever made a cup of tea, then the amount of milk that I'm going to add each time is a bit like the amount that you'd put in a cup of tea, just a little splash. And then we're going to keep stirring. It's not a particularly nice noise, that one, sorry. Keep stirring and adding, and stirring and adding. And we are looking for a very specific type of texture. It's going to look like Play-Doh, the type of Play-Doh that you all think that you played with as a child, but actually it was probably more recent, because all kids like Play-Doh. And even my children now, quite into Play-Doh now and again. So, we're adding and stirring. And I'm not doing it too quick because if I put it all in one and I add too much, we're going to end up with scone soup. And that's no good for anybody, is it? Now I can feel now, there's a little bit left, look. I can feel that that is getting to be a little bit wet. Can you see, look, it's wet there. And yet there's some dry around the edge. So if I stir now with this knife, I think that I can get that all to come together. And if I can just tip the bowl up and show you what you're looking at here. What we're looking at is we're looking at it trying to pull the dry stuff from around the edge of the bowl. Yeah, that's going to do it. Now, from experience, I can tell you that the best tool to get that all pulled together with is stuck to the end of your arm. So I'm going to put my hands in now and I'm going to see if I can push all that together. Because I didn't add all the milk at once and therefore I didn't end up with scone soup, I've now got the option to add a tiny bit more if I need to. And you know, I might, you know, because I've got this dry stuff, look, and I think perhaps I was just needing the tiniest bit more, not a lot. There we are. Let's see if that will work. That's better. And so, the best advice I can give you at this point is moderation. Just add it little by little, and you'll not go far wrong. Okay, so we've now got to the point where we've got a dough that looks a bit like Play-Doh. And you might have seen people at this point rolling it out and cutting it out with special cutters which you may not have at home. I'm going to make something different. I'm going to make what's called a cottage scone, and that means that I only need to cut it, which is much better. So we're going to need to put this out onto the table. If it was sticky at this point, and mine isn't, I'm just going to try and show you that. So if it was sticky at this point, then I would need a little bit of flour on the table. But mine actually is not sticky to touch, so I'm not going to put any on, but you can most definitely if you need some. I've made sure that the table's nice and clean as well. And I'm just going to pop the dough onto the table. I'm not going to work it too much because I don't want it to get tough, because that's the working of things with flour in, increase the gluten content. That's why your bread's nice and tough on the outside. But we don't really want that, as I said before, so I'm not going to work it loads. We don't have to knead it now. All I really need to do at this point is kind of push it into a disc shape. If you can imagine like a big hockey puck or a cake, or I can't think of another disc shape, the shape of a paracetamol but bigger. That's what we're after. We're after a flat top and straight sides like that. And if you put your middle finger to your thumb, that kind of size is exactly what we're looking for, and I think that that's all right. Back to the round bladed knife, and we're going to cut it now like you would cut a pizza. And we're going to make 8, which means that we're going to do a cross, like Xbox cross, and over the top of it, a plus sign, like you would find in maths, and that will give us 8. So let's go. I'm going to start with the plus sign, so effectively I've cut it in half. That's right. Now I'm going to cut it horizontally, so effectively I've cut it into 4, and then each of those gets cut in half again by the diagonal cross, like the Xbox cross. And so what we'll find is we've got 8 evenly sized, if we can, pieces that we're going to put in the oven. They have to be evenly sized, because if you don't make them the same, that means the smallest one of what you've made will burn before the largest one is cooked. So it makes much more sense to make sure that they're all the same size. Here's my baking tray. And what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to pop them on the baking tray, and I'm going to leave a little bit of room. So usually what I do, and this is probably me just being a little bit of a neat freak, but I like to go up, down, like an arrow, up, down, like that. just make it the opposite way. It really doesn't matter as long as you leave a little bit of room between. I get that this is me being a bit odd, but don't care. Right, so remember that we left a little bit of sugar at the end to pop onto the top. So what I'm going to do is, if you've got the tiniest bit of milk left, and even if you haven't, a tiny bit of water on the end of your finger would do. You just wet the top just by using your finger. You don't need a specific tool or a pastry brush or anything. If you just kind of dab the top a bit like that with some milk, it makes the sugar stick. So then we can just go ahead and sprinkle a little bit of that sugar on each one. Don't do it from a height. We're not doing like Salt Bae or anything, because it'll just make it more difficult to clean up after, and the sugar that just ends up on the tray will caramelise and turn into toffee, and you'll not be able to get it off, and your mum or dad won't thank you for that. So that is my scones recipe, and just to recap, just in case you didn't get time to write the ingredients down the first time, or maybe I missed some out, it was 250 grams of self-raising flour, 50 grams of preferably hard margarine, but soft margarine works just fine, 25 grams of caster sugar plus extra for sprinkling, and 125 millilitres of milk, although I poured 150 just in case I needed a little bit extra. I'm going to put those in the oven now. They'll take about 10 minutes, and my oven's set to 190 degrees, or about gas mark 4 to 5 dependent on your oven. Put them in the middle so that they don't burn. And when they're done, they look nice and golden brown, just like digestive biscuits do, that kind of colour. I have really enjoyed talking to you today in this little corner of my kitchen. This is the only corner that's tidy, just saying. And I'm going to try and bring you some more cooking from home, because, as I said right at the beginning, not only is it good for school and your knowledge, it's also good for giving to people as gifts to cheer them up a bit in this rather terrible time. So from Mrs. Code's kitchen, that's a goodbye from me. And I'm going to have to do this now because I'm not very technical.